I'm very happy to be here as a new board member of the Institute. I joined late last year, and it's an honor to be here in front of you and getting the chance to speak on not just one, but two of my favorite subjects, Ayn Rand and myself, in that order of priority, I would like to say. So I have to give you a little bit of background because I'm from Europe, Ayn Rand was, at least not when I was young, was not a household name in Europe. So I didn't actually really get engaged till I was about 38, which means that I'd like to give you just 5 minutes of context of what happened before Ayn Rand, because there is also a life before Ayn Rand in some cases. So I grew up in the countryside, living alone with my father. My parents got divorced early on, so I lived with my father. He was a bit of an old school conservative. He lived his childhood, at least part of it, during the German occupation of Denmark in the Second World War, from when he was 10 to 15. So obviously that made a big impression on him, and he was pretty clear about how he looked at that. So things were pretty black and white in our home. There was the good guys and there was the bad guys. And the good guys were obviously the Americans and the British that helped us get out of that situation. And the bad guys were the Nazis and the fascists and the communists. So that was nice to have that settled from day one. I can remember I challenged it once in my life because I was in my school, probably been about 12 or 13, and they made us read a poem by Bertolt Brecht, where there was some kind of message like, it wasn't really the kings that built the castles, it were the workers. And I thought, technically that probably, there's some truth to that, but on the other hand, if the kings had no impact, I guess the world would be full of castles, because then people would build them all the time. Nevertheless, I thought I'll question that with my dad. So I asked him, is it true that it was really the workers that built the great castles of the world? And that wasn't very popular. So he said, are you a communist? And I said, no. And that was really the last time I tested my father on that. But I still remember it to this day, and he didn't look very happy with me. So he was an academic, and I actually had decent grades in high school or in college. So it's kind of expected that I was going to go to university. I was very interested in archaeology and classical stuff. So I had a long, hard think about what line of study would be the right one to pursue and what I wanted to do with my academic career. And after some consideration, I went to the south of Spain and opened a bar instead. So as you heard, Yaron's ambition was to go in 10 or 15 years to the south of Spain on a beach. I did it the other way around. And I really have to say, although I loved it, and it was a very interesting experience, I don't think really, Yaron, that it would suit you. So wherever you are, think that very closely over before you do it. Nevertheless, it was a capitalistic experience because there wasn't an awful lot of rules in south of Spain in the early 80s. We're talking 81, 82. So we opened a bar, we bought some drinks, and we sold them a little more expensive than we bought them. And that was actually quite an interesting learning curve for a young boy that wanted to be an archaeologist. But nevertheless, I also felt it wasn't really what I wanted to do with all of my life. I actually began to read the Financial Times every day down there. I must have been the only bar owner at that time reading Financial Times every day. It was always 3 days late because it took a long time to get it down there. But if you're consistently 3 days late and you're not actually investing, it kind of feels the same. But that gave me a taste for actually going to London and doing something in the financial sector. Now, going to London and trading foreign exchange and commodities and derivatives and stuff like that, that's a pretty efficient school for understanding capitalism. because there's not much room there for dreaming or hoping or evading reality when you're leveraged 50 to 1 against the yen, or you have a sophisticated derivative on soybeans or something like that. Reality tends to hit you pretty aggressively if you get it wrong. And hence, I think that was a very good learning curve also for sort of capitalism in the real world, the traders and the free markets and the power of the market and the respect you have to have for the market. So if you're irrational in that kind of environment, you lie to yourself, you die pretty quickly, I would say. So after that, I thought I'd like to do my own business. I spent 5 or 6 years in London. And we opened something called Saxo Bank, which is going to be the main, my practical applications of these values in that context will be the main subject of this talk. I hope that it can have some interest. I imagine that many of you are either involved in business, or some of the younger ones of you want to go out there and do business, and at least you can get some idea of how I implemented the values in my business. And others of you want to be academics and go down that route, and then it's probably quite healthy for you to hear a little bit about business as well, right? So hopefully it won't be too boring. In Saxo Bank, it's the same thing. We had clients, we traded, we're quite speculative. Losses and gains teach you a lesson pretty quickly. And also, I built in what is a very socialistic society. Denmark has had then and has today one of the highest tax pressures in the world, and a massive part of the economy is public. But we were a very capitalist company, me and my partner back then, a gentleman called Kim Fournet, and we were pretty outspoken in our views. So that was a bit of a weird American-like animal in a social welfare state in Scandinavia, but we did run the business with a heavy focus on performance. We paid people well if they did well. We paid them less well if they didn't do so well, and if they didn't do well at all, we said goodbye to them. And this is just not very common in Scandinavia, where things tend to be very egalitarian. I remember we made a mission statement to try to express where we wanted the business to go. We did that without a clear guidance. Ideologically, I read a lot of books in my younger years, but I didn't have so much time to think about those things when we were building the business. So we said, let's do it ground up. Let's listen to everybody. Let's hear their views. And we ended predictably up with a 7-page long document, and that was in like font size 9 or something like that, with everything under the sun. A lot of it good stuff, but also a little bit confused and a little bit, politically correct, which actually I'm happy to say in Saxo Bank we didn't have to write down to respect meritocratic work rather than whether people had this or that political, sexual connotation or color or background or whatever. We tried to reward people if they did a good job. So it still worked. We grew, we innovated, we brought out one of the first trading platforms for foreign exchange in the world, but it was not so. We had principles, of course, but it was more leading by example and hard work, I would say, than a strong, powerful ideological line. And now Ayn Rand comes into the picture, so don't worry, it's not all about my childhood and pre-Rand. I had a great chief economist, actually still with the bank, Sten Jacobsen. You may see him on CNBC quite frequently, or some of the other business channels, a great guy. And he came to me, it was after a summer holiday, 2000, I think, and he threw this book on my table. It was very greasy because it was one of the really cheap paperbacks, with sun oil in half of the pages and stuff. And I said, you have to read this book. And I said, okay. And you can't probably guess which one it was. It could be 2 or 3, but it was Atlas Shrugged. And I said, when Sten says it's that good, then I better read it. I had actually had a chance to read Atlas Shrugged in my youth because a few people had recommended it, but somehow I never got around to it. And actually, I regret that because I would have very much liked to have read that 20 years earlier in my life. But we are where we are. So I got it there in in 2000. And I don't have to tell people in this room what a big revelation it is when you read one of these books the first time. Everything fell into place. I actually did read quite extensively libertarian and political commentary when I was very young. I was a member of the Young Conservatives in Denmark. And I had a pretty clear idea of what works and what doesn't work. But again, this feeling of everything falling into place and understanding the philosophical foundation for why you were actually right along the way, that was pretty helpful, I would say. Also, the other thing about that Yaron mentioned earlier, that being explicit, there's a lot of things implicit. I don't think a good business can function without really sort of intuitively deploying a lot of the values that we do, but it helps a lot to be explicit about it. So I thought, after having read that, my partner read it, was equally excited about it. So he said, why don't we use this in a corporate context? Why don't we use it in the business? It was clearly directed also at individuals, but the 7 virtues seem to make a lot of sense from an organizational point of view. So I then said, let's do a new mission statement, because this old thing just doesn't fit. And I wrote top down this time something derived from the book, a 1 A4 page, and it still stands today, 17, 18 years later. Hasn't had any need for changing it or even adjusting it. So that shows a little bit how strong that message is. Subsequently, at any employment interviews, and there's quite a lot. We have about 1,500 employees at the moment, and of course there's significant churn. So this must have been thousands of people over the years. So at all, even whether we ended up hiring people or not, we actually gave them this corporate statement to make sure they understood what they were getting into. As I said, we're in a socialist welfare state in Scandinavia, and we just wanted to make sure that people got what they were getting into. It's a capitalist company, and we have some strong values that we expect you to at least sympathize with. And we also, when we hired people, we always gave them a copy of Atlas Shrugged. And actually, I think a great deal of them read them. It's not like we came back to them and asked them 20 questions in it or anything, but they all got one, they all got the chance. As Yaron kindly mentioned earlier, actually we printed a great deal more and shared them with lots of people around, particularly the Danish society. I think every single politician at the time, every single mayor, every single political commentator, every single leader of any significant lobbying organization, we sent an Atlas Shrugged back in around about 2001, 2002. Actually, referring to one of the things Yaron was talking about, early experiences with China, I spoke to Yaron at the time about having these books, and I said it'd be really nice if we could write our own foreword in the book. And that was met with some skepticism, because the idea of having your writings next to Ayn Rand's was something that at least they wanted to be absolutely sure what we wrote, and I wrote a page and a half or something like that, and then I understood that Leonard himself was going to review it and send it back to me for commentary. So it's like, whoa, what's going to happen? But actually, I'm proud to say it only came back with one red line. And that was because I had mentioned in there that actually, bizarrely, in an absurd way, capitalism was freer in China than in the United States. And he didn't like that. So I took it out, but I think actually also, when you think about what Yaron said, there's some truth to it, that although the rest of the society is not liberalistic at all, the economic freedom is actually quite high and has had the predictable results of bringing China and the Chinese into a completely different level of wealth. So we began a practical implementation of this in the bank. I gave a number of lectures, always to new employees. We would give them obviously a program when they joined, and they would learn this, that, and the other about the different departments. But there would always be a presentation on the virtues, or we call them the values in the bank, but same thing. we were using basically, so everybody would be acquainted with our thinking behind this and encouraged to at least think about these principles and these virtues. We also had Yaron and other good people coming by, particularly Yaron on multiple occasions, speaking broadly to our employees, all of them, and a little bit more directed about leadership to our management group. So we did a lot to try to implement the 7 virtues into the business. We had a role model program where we tried to point out people that we thought both performed well, both from an economic point of view, but also from a value and an interaction point of view. And then actually this role model program, although people were sort of a little blasé about it, you could see every time you got somebody in there, they were really, really proud. And somebody that didn't go in there for a couple of years would come and ask, could it be my turn next time? What am I doing wrong? And I think this was quite powerful way of implementing it. There was typically around 100 out of the 1,000 plus employees that were taking out for their particular contribution for the bank. And you know what? The reaction from the employees, although we are in a different kind of society than the US, that's for sure. When you see what's happening around you, we had at the time one TV channel owned by the government. Just imagine that, right? And today we have 2 big channels owned by the government. But so we're making progress. But we also have a number of private ones. But the 2 big ones are still largely controlled by one completely and one largely by the government. But actually, people liked it. They liked it a lot. They like people generally to be in value-driven organizations. They like to understand what you're trying to achieve. They like to understand what principles we are basing things on. And I got a lot of positive feedback on these things over the years. I would say a lot of them went to great lengths to study it themselves, read other books, implemented the virtues in their own living and in their own perspective on life. And I would even say some of them actually left the bank because they got so excited about this, they wanted to do their own business. And I think that's great. I have absolutely no problem with people moving in and out of the bank and doing other stuff. If they move to other companies, they normally come back after a while. But they go and open their own companies, I think, is something we all should strive for as business people. And that's also why it is really, really important to get more businesses to adopt this kind of thinking, this kind of philosophy, these virtues, and thereby, of course, create good and healthy businesses, but also the sort of trigger that other people get inspired to creating businesses that create jobs, create products, create innovations. I was enormously pleased to find out after a few years, because I didn't know at the time, that John Allison in BB&T had done pretty much the same thing with, I would say, even better results than we had in Saxo Bank. But it was nice to see another bank actually having deployed the virtues in the same very pervasive way. So I think in general that it was very well received, and if people didn't receive it well, maybe it was because they actually didn't really like capitalism, or they didn't like business in the first place. And of course, you have a few of those slip through the net every now and again. As Yaron said, it is really, really true. I would say several times a month I receive a thank you note from people that got the book, or people that worked for me or still work for me, and say that this made a really big difference. Thank you very much. So I think it is something that everyone can do, is to hand out a few books every now and again. If you hit the right people with those books, you can change their life, or certainly impact it for the better. And it's really nice now. I mean, we're still handing out books up until much later, but to get something for something you did 15 years ago, saying this is one of the greatest things that ever happened in my life, that you gave me that book, is a very satisfying feeling. And I can only urge you to do the same if you have the right context for doing it. So I would say, let me try to be a little more specific here, because I'd like to present to you how I would largely have presented this to a new class of employees in Saxo Bank about why these virtues and values are relevant for the business and what they mean in practical terms. So it will go something like that, and I'll try to give you that impression of how we specifically deployed them. So we'll start out by explaining, that you may not necessarily be guaranteed a successful career or a fantastic life. Stuff can happen, accidents can happen, illness, random elements can interfere in your life. So you may not be guaranteed a successful life by applying these values to your work and to your life in general. But it's very difficult to imagine that anyone could live successfully if they continuously disregarded those values or distorted the values or violated these values. And we would ask people to do an experiment thinking thoroughly through, if you were continuously dishonest to your co-workers, to your clients, and how long do you think that you could keep any kind of trust? And if you didn't have any trust, how would you work with your clients after that? Or if you completely disregarded justice, so you never made any difference between people doing a good job on your teams and people doing a bad job on your teams, if you never made any distinction between valuable and worthless activities, why do you think your team would prosper? How would you get the right people to be motivated to achieve the objectives that you have? I don't think anybody would really want to associate with you in the long run, nobody decent anyway, if you felt that there was no distinguishment in your life between good and evil. And so it goes for all these values. They are necessary ingredients for a good life, and in a business context, they're essential to building a strong, reliable, competitive business. So then we would go into more specifics around rationality. What does rationality really mean when you're in a business environment? Actually, it seems pretty obvious if somebody says, would you be rational? It seems like pretty obviously that the answer would be yes. But actually, even in many private corporates or private businesses, there's a lot of time spent on very irrational activities and very unproductive activities. And I think what we tried to explain people was that rationality means applying a logical process to a logical approach to identifying how will we arrive at a desired or given value that we were trying to achieve in the most efficient and most straight-line manner. What information would we take into account to make the right decisions and to decide on the optimal path of a specific action? Another thing would be, and this happens a lot, to be honest, a competitor out there produces a better product than your own, or a better little thing in his product than your own, or slightly better pricing or whatever. You cannot ignore it. A salesman will sometimes be tempted to say, just lie about it and say, no, it's not true, and look at this, maybe he's a bit better on dollar yen, but look at our option module. It doesn't matter if the guy wants to trade dollar yen. So it's absolutely necessary that if you meet that kind of stuff, not to evade it, not to try to tell a lie or hope that the client forgets, because the other guys have got good salespeople too. It is absolutely necessary that instead you sit down, you analyze, and investigate thoroughly where it is that these guys are better than us, and what is the industry, where is it developing, and how do we improve our own service to make sure that we're always genuinely the best at what we're trying to sell. So trying to explain to them that you have to deal with these things head on. You cannot dream or lie or hope that things will fix themselves. Client demand is very real, and you need to respect it. And if somebody can get a bit better deal somewhere else, why on earth should we expect them to deal with us? Another thing in rationality is, and this is a big problem in many organizations, is that if you have a disagreement with a colleague, you need to address that head on. You cannot be at the water cooler or speaking badly about the guy or trying to undermine the person's position. You need to speak to people head on. We did it very physically sometimes when we heard a little bit of this. We'd take one guy here and one guy here, put them into a room and say, now you two talk to each other. And they learned pretty quickly, because it wasn't very nice to get into that room when Kim and I was also there. So after a while, they began to understand that it might be easier just to do it yourself before we got wind of it. And again, to make sure that you address these conflicts up front is very, very important. Another thing is that, of course, these people in your organization are ambitious. I hope so, because otherwise, I don't think you really should have them if they don't have at least an ambition of delivering a great product or a great service. But they can also be so ambitious that they will always pursue their own line of thought if they feel that if that goes through, that's going to benefit me, and I'm going to get one up on somebody, one of my colleagues, even if actually he or she has a better idea. So trying there to be intellectually honest about what is the right idea here, even if it's not my own. I mean, we all love our own ideas, and sometimes actually, rarely, sometimes actually they are the best, but some of the time they're not. And it's very, very important to have the intellectual honesty to recognize that, to select the right idea and then move forward. And of course, as a leader, it's very important also that you then also reward that when you see it, that you praise it and you say to people, you know what, you did the right thing, and you're also recognized for that. As a whole, it's extremely important to recognize people for what they do. At the end of the day, many people will rather have a slap on the back and a nice little recognition in front of their peers than a salary raise. It's also cheaper sometimes, but for sure it works well, and that's because people want to have self-esteem. They want to take pride in what they do, and they want people to recognize that. And if that's justified, you definitely have to do your best to recognize it. Independence, I think we also try to explain to people exactly what that means. And it's particularly to make them understand that there is no such thing as group thinking. There is no such thing as a team that sits down and thinks as a group. There's absolutely the possibility that a number of smart people work together and arrive at a better result. I would say that actually is the rule rather than the exception, because I rarely put 6 intelligent people into a room to discuss one of my own ideas, for example, and not walked out with some degree of improvement on that idea. So for sure, you want to get people to cooperate and think together, but they have to at the same time understand that it is the individuals that do the thinking and not the group. There is no such thing as a collective brain, and you need to really make people stand up and take accountability for doing some of that thinking. Make them understand also that thinking, they need to deploy it, and they need to understand that it is their number one, or maybe even their only tool for being successful in their life, for achieving a great career, for taking lots of money home so they can give their family a good life, and maybe one day start their own business. And the only tool you really have for that is your brain, right? On the other hand, it's important also to emphasize to people that independence of mind doesn't mean that you should completely disregard what everybody else says. You should have, of course, respect for people that went there before you. We all stand on the shoulders of giants in some respect, and also that if you have a leader in your team that's trying to lead a team, of course you need to respect that. You can question it, and you're very likely and very welcome to question it. But at the end of the day, there also has got to be a degree of respect for the organization's goals. So independence doesn't mean continuously being critical of everything around you and not wanting to listen to anyone. But it's a combination of being critical where it needs to be. It also doesn't mean you can't learn from anybody else. I think it's incredibly important to look at other people as role models and for practical leadership. But at the same time, that doesn't mean that you blindly copy or repeat everything that somebody else does without truly understanding why, because then you're going to have another problem, right? Actually, it's funny. I saw a number of traders over my life, obviously, and some of them would be like, they just simply couldn't make up their own mind whether they should buy or sell. So they come to me and say, "What do you think, Lars? What do you think?" I think it's going up. Do you really? Yeah, I think it's going up. How high? I think maybe that or that level. I say, "Okay, I'll go and buy some." But then on the way, he might meet somebody else, and he said, "What do you think?" And that person would say, "I think it's definitely going in the hole. It's going to crash from here, right?" I say, "Are you sure?" And then he probably would go and sell because that's the last thing he heard, you know. And obviously, that didn't end very well. But you know, so it's not blindly copying either. But it's very good to certainly take input and listen to other people that, at least if they have qualified reason to speak to you. Integrity is also, well, they're all very important, as we all know, but also for people to understand what we mean by that. And of course that means that it's not enough to have a lot of good ideas. It's also important to execute them. It's not enough to hand out promises of future successes without actually delivering them over time. And it's about doing what you say you're going to do and honoring your commitments and fulfilling your promises. It is accepting that there is a clear relationship between the dreams you have for your life and the dreams you have for your career and the actual work that you go and put in every day to achieve those dreams, to move yourself forward in the right direction. And those two things are just very, very interconnected, the mental side of it and the actual physical doing of things. Of course, in a financial services industry and any business really with clients, it's also critical to extend that integrity in your interactions with the clients. You know, to not promise them more than we can reasonably certainly deliver, to make sure that they understand, particularly in the financial sector, the risks and the exposures that they may enter into, so that we always manage people's expectations in a positive way, and certainly try never to deliver less than what they expect, and hopefully sometimes surprise them on the positive side. But again, it's a question of integrity, of making sure that people understand what they're going to achieve. Honesty. I touched a little bit on intellectual honesty, and I think that is about also being honest in your perception of reality and meeting these potential and very real challenges head on with an honest view, not trying to, you know, fiddle the numbers so some of it looks a little bit better. You know, you have to be very, very, very careful with things like number targets, what we call KPIs, key performance indicators. I mean, I can remember once we said, we change every now and again depending on what we thought was most important for the business. But once Kim and I decided we wanted to have a lot of clients. We also like a lot of clients, but we made it a specific KPI that people should do that. And there was one particular office where the clients just were pouring in, you know, and we say, oh, that's really great, you know, and you should have a big bonus and this and that. And then we looked a little bit at the numbers. And the vast majority of these clients opened accounts with $10 in them. So we're like, well, you know, we got actually what we wanted, but we maybe forgot to say it should be relevant clients for the business. And in that sense, it's very, very dangerous to, if you say to people, we only want clients that bring $100,000 or more, well, then you'll see people bringing in low velocity assets like bonds, because a lot of people don't really care where they have their bonds. But then again, on a $100,000 bond deposit, you make no money as an investment bank. You can make good money on an active trade on $100,000 in stocks or foreign exchange. So again, if you put that out without qualifying it, you get all the wrong kinds of accounts in, because so really goal setting is extraordinarily important. And the amount of ingenuity and innovative thinking that can go into gaming any given set of numbers you give a group of salespeople is quite impressive, to be honest. So, in general, dishonesty doesn't work. I think it's pretty fair to say, and I think we all have experienced that somewhere along our lives if we try to get out of a difficult situation by a small or even worse, a big lie. But for example, you know, I fail to understand why some people would come to a job interview and lie about their achievements and their capacities to do this or that. And you may hire them because they're good salespeople. Some people are great at doing CVs and great at doing interviews. But once you have them in there, they're not so great at anything else. But what's the purpose? Because of course I'm going to find out after 3 or 6 or 9 months that everything was a lie. And in the meantime, and then I'm going to have to let them go. And in the meantime, that person has lost 6 or 9 months where where potentially he or she could have been doing something that actually was something that they could have handled. So it's a complete waste of everybody's time, and it will always be found out. It's the same thing if you are portraying to be somebody else's when you're trying to get friends, or you're trying to pretend you're rich if you're not, or you're trying to pretend that you're very interested in opera if you're trying to pick up a given girlfriend or something. And eventually your friends will find out you're not rich, and the girl will find out you didn't like opera so much, or you'll have a miserable life if you don't like opera, right? So at the end of the day, it's always going to come back and bite you, and I don't understand why people do it, but I think it's something that you should always stress to people that you work with, that it simply doesn't make sense to lie. Justice is very important. I touched upon it. It is very, very important that you react to what you see that's good and to what you see that's not good. If you don't, people will disrespect you because they will. Why should they try to make you happy if you don't recognize that they're doing a good job? And so it can only ever be the bad that benefits from this, because ultimately the good person, unless driven by some very, very strong internal motive, will just stop doing a good job if there's absolutely no recognition of it, or at least not do a perfect job. The other thing is that's a big deal. I think you need to stress to people in your business is that if you see somebody else doing something wrong, intentionally or unintentionally, you have to address it. You have to tell that person that this is not the right way to do it. Yaron mentioned Jack Welch earlier on. I'm actually happy to say that I know Jack a little bit, and he's a fan of Saxo Bank. He's at least on numerous occasions spoken nicely about it. But he told me a story once, because he was traveling this enormous amount of factories and different offices that GE has. It literally takes years to visit every single point, and Jack Welch did that on a regular basis. So he would fly around day after day and making pretty much the same speech in 6 or 7 locations to gather people on one song sheet. And he said one day an elderly lady came up to him after that and was crying, and he said, why are you crying, ma'am? And she said, well, just before we came here, I was told that I was fired. And he said, well, why did you get fired? And she said, well, they said that I didn't do my job well enough. But why couldn't they have told me that before they fired me? And I think that's very true, that if you don't tell people that they're not doing what you expect them to do, or they're not doing it well, you have to tell them before it gets to a point where it has negative consequences for them or for the business itself, right? But a lot of people shy away from that, and obviously as a top level, C-level person, you can't see everything that's going on in all of the corners of the office and on the trading floor, etc., and particularly in somewhere like financial trading areas where a small error can become extremely costly, or a regulatory breach can basically cost you your license, cost you your business. It's critically important that you keep an eye on people doing something untoward, or even doing something that's just not a good way of doing things. But people shy away a little bit from that because they don't like to say it to people, and it's easier not to do it. And you're actually not doing anybody a favor by not telling them if they're doing something wrong. On the other hand, you should always remember, and that is hard to remember, but you should always remember that if somebody's doing something great, you also have to tell them that. This is equally important, that people feel recognized for really doing the extra mile, really, really, really trying to do a great job. And that's the same thing, both, of course, from a management level, but also in a team and between peers, that they point out if you're doing something wrong, not necessarily in a highly critical or very negative fashion, but also that they remember to be respectful and praise their colleagues if they're doing something really, really good and valuable. So I think that's also, all these values are highly relevant for business, of course. Productivity, productiveness is obviously critical in any business, and it is really great fun to sit and do PowerPoints and sit around a table and have meetings and have new meetings and discuss what was it we agreed last time. I can't remember. It's nice, but at the end of the day, there's got to be a productive outcome in at least if you're a private business, right? So there has to be a productive outcome, and always that productive outcome should preferably be very clear from the outset, because you don't want to have too many roundabout ways to get there. That doesn't mean that you shouldn't do your homework, or you shouldn't sit and do the necessary number of meetings and PowerPoints. Actually, going back to Jack Welch, he had this thing that he always wanted people to present an idea on one A4 page. If they presented on 2 or more, he would send them back and say, I'm not going to read 10 pages about this. If you can't express it on 1 page, you probably can't express it on 10 pages, right? I was always thinking a little bit because they do nuclear power plants and stuff like that, right? But still, it is true that you need to get to the concrete, specific proposals and the productivity, because at the end of the day, that is the only way to fend for yourself. There are alternatives. You can steal other people's money, or you can beg and be very dependent on people's money. And unfortunately, increasingly, you can vote for politicians that give you money. But at the end of the day, if you really want to be successful and free, you need to produce yourself. And hence, any project that you initiate, no matter how intellectually stimulating, has got to have a productive end and a productive outcome. Doesn't mean it always works out. Lots of failures in my life, but that's part of trying things, right? And the most important thing is really not that your mistakes get too expensive, right? So if something doesn't work, get rid of it or stop it, but there always has to be some intention of $1 at the end of the line. And I think this whole productivity aspect is also very important for your self-esteem. We all know how great it is when you finish a job and it's well done and you go out and celebrate. Incidentally, we celebrate a lot in the bank. Again, actually, also something Jack Welch put enormous emphasis on. I have a lot of respect for Jack Welch, and although some of the young Silicon Valley types maybe think he's a little outdated, I can assure you he's not. If you read his book Winning or something, it's still highly relevant for running any kind of business. And he believes a lot in celebrating, only if there's something to celebrate. It's not like you just celebrate just to make it look something, but if you have real achievement, send the guys and girls out in town with a check and let them have a good dinner and a few drinks, and then get back to work on Monday and look forward, because you can't rest on the laurels either. So obviously that's very key to success, that you have a productive outcome at the end of any process. And finally, pride, which is certainly in my home country, Denmark, where the bank is very international. We have offices in more than 20 locations around the world. But we are Danish, and we came from Denmark originally. And in Denmark, we have a really strong. It's getting better actually, in line with what Jaron was also talking about earlier. But we have a strong tall poppy syndrome. We call it the law of Jante, which is a short law that some writer defined many years ago, which is that you should never think that you're more than anything else. You should never think that you're better than anybody else. You should never try to do better than anybody else. And this was it's pretty widespread, to the point that some of Denmark's most successful business people drive around in very modest cars, so nobody can figure out that they're actually rich. Their houses are well hidden away. They like the luxury when you sit with them privately. They like the Chateau Latour when you have a private dinner with them, but when they go to a restaurant, they'll have something completely different, right? So that's a big, but I would say diminishing problem in Denmark. So we have to extra emphasize that to people, that if you do a good job, you're entitled to feel proud about it. You're entitled to celebrate it. Not be an asshole, not be bragging, not be obnoxious, of course, but go out there and enjoy that you did something good and be proud of it. And if it's that good, buy yourself a nice watch or a nice gift for your wife or whatever, But don't walk around along the walls and be worried that people see that you're actually doing a good job. So this was actually one of the harder things to get people to embrace, which you would have thought was one of the easier things once you've done all the other stuff. But actually standing up and feeling good about what you've done and feeling proud about it is very difficult for people, certainly in my country and in a number of other European countries. I don't think it's quite so severe here in the US, but there's still, examples of it, I think, when you're here. So this is to give you an idea of how we deploy this more specifically in a Saxo Bank context. I think that the really important experience here is that, you could imagine that some people say, here comes again with all his values and all that nonsense. Let me get back to job, right? But actually, people embrace it. They like very much that you are very explicit in what they want to understand what you expect from them. They also want to understand that what they intuitively felt actually has some foundation, some logical foundation. So, and they actually feel proud going out and saying, well, I work for a company that has a set of values, because many other companies don't. Or let me rephrase that, they probably have a set of values, but they have been created randomly and are not very clear and are not necessarily very good. You can be sure that any organization will develop some internal principles and some ways of cooperating, but there's a big risk that these will, at best, not be very coherent, and at worst, actually be very negative if you don't try to manage that process. So the more explicit you can be in terms of these values, the better, and actually the more the employees will appreciate it. So I'll say today, I think genuinely most of the colleagues that I've had at the bank, I think most of them have read Atlas Shrugged, or at least significant proportions of it. I would say that the vast majority of them are good capitalists. I would think you wouldn't be overly happy as a socialist in Saxo Bank, but I hope not anyway. But and we have still sessions every now and again where old employees also can refresh their knowledge. So if some of you out there are thinking or are involved in business or thinking about starting your own business or want a meaningful existence in somebody else's business, just to sort of wrap it up in more specific things, I think to have the value set very explicit is super important. That you live them yourself is obviously critical. And hereby I don't mean that you have to run around and be a prince on a white horse. I for sure am not one of those, but I do try to roughly take the medicine that I prescribe for everybody else. And you have to preach them and repeat them and make them understood, that not maybe at the deepest objectivist level, but understand why actually they're right and why they lead to good results. I think that if you have people that don't live them or don't respect them, you have to be very consequent about it. Even if it's your best sales guy, if he's completely out of line with the values that you want to have to let him go. And I mean, that's hard if he's bringing in money to the table, but if they see that's enough for you to not think about the values anymore, that if you just make enough money you can do whatever you want, then you're dead. I can assure you that, right? So you have to actually live it. I think the idea of a role model program where you actually point to that's the kind of behavior we appreciate, that's the kind of behavior we appreciate, I think it's good. It's I think a nice way to give people something to observe and actually. Then having that role, being selected as a role model, will put some additional emphasis and pressure on those people to make sure that they actually do the right thing most of the time. So it has a double positive effect in my view. Make sure that people get the chance to actually learn this through smaller or bigger courses. Try to make them self-assess every now and again. I always said to people when I gave them this one-page mission statement and value statement, try to read it once a month, once every second month, whatever you feel like, right? But try to analyze: did I really live up to the virtue of honesty this month in everything I did? Did I really put productivity into every project I did, and I think it's very helpful for people to self-assess them. And I think, as I said at the beginning, I think no company that didn't have at least a significant proportion of good values can be very successful. So I think some people arrive there more or less by chance. And again, as Joran said very eloquently, that's maybe human nature actually to just do the right thing in spite of all the nonsense you're getting taught by schools and universities. So people actually are sort of gravitating towards the right decisions because otherwise they don't see the outcomes that they want. But nevertheless, I think it is very wise to make sure that you choose the values in your company. You can discuss it with people, but just that they're chosen, they're not there by coincidence or by randomness. And also when you're cooperating with other companies, which you frequently do, then choose those partners carefully, because if they have a completely different value set, then that's a problem, right? On a more personal level, as I said, I think I try to do that myself, and by far sometimes I'm disappointed in my own lack of ability to always do the right things. But I think you need to have a check against your own expectations every now and again. I think it's important to remember that the various practical applications, and it's important also not to be scared to be proud of things and share that pride with the people that work in your business. I think generally speaking up for what you think is right, even if it can be a little bit unpleasant sometimes in a society like, for example, where most people disagree with what you think. I still think you have to do it. You have to support organizations like this. Together with Annie that's sitting there, we founded Ayn Rand Institute Europe, which I think has brought at least more events to various European venues, and I think that's important. We also, together with a couple of other people, Annie's actually a member of that as well, we started the only liberalistic as you can get in Denmark party about 10 years ago. We brought it from 0 to actually today having six ministers in the government, and our party leader is Vice Prime Minister and the Foreign Minister of Denmark. So all of that I think would not have been possible without having a very clear focus on a value set, on defining where you wanted to go and make a good plan, and then execute it pretty stringently. So that's how I've tried to use it. At the end of the day, does it work? Well, I'll tell you something interesting. I didn't actually think so specifically about it till I was preparing this presentation, but I would say in terms of application of the values for Saxo Bank, we have three periods, I would say. We have the pre-RAND period, the full-on RAND period, and the not-so-full-on RAND period, right? Obviously, I didn't hear about it till 2000. We founded the company in 1992, so that would be pre-RAND, although, of course, we had other values and I think did a few sensible things prior to reading Atlas Rock as well. Then we had this sort of revelation that we all know in 2000, and then we were very, as I described, implemented them across the organization. And then I made actually, I can say this in this very little closed group of friends, but I made a really big mistake in 2008 by putting a couple of external guys to de facto manage the business for me, because everybody convinced us, Kim and I started 2 people and the organization grew and grew, and people said, oh, you got to bring in professionals, So in the end, they convinced us. It was also quite convenient after many years of extremely hard work that we thought both the business would be greater and we would have a little bit more time. So we brought in a couple of people that turned out were good business people, but just had a very different value set. So I'll say that the whole application of RAND values was diluted quite significantly in the subsequent period. After about 4 or 5 years, Kim and I said, this just doesn't work. We have to go back in and take control. But in the meantime, I had moved to Switzerland, so I wasn't in the head office. And while it's still a good business, still an ongoing business, I would have to admit that, and I haven't been operationally involved in it for 2.5 years, we are not as stringent as we was in that period from 2000 to 2008 on really implementing it across the entire organization. So if you look at those 3 periods, I was actually looking at them from a pure economic point of view, because funnily enough, we raised a little bit of funds along the way on convenient periods that mark this. So in 2001, we raised a little bit of capital because we wanted to go from being a broker to being a full bank. And at that time, we raised that at a market cap for the company of $20 million approximately. So from 1992 to 2001, we had created a business that was worth $20 million, Then we raised again money in 2008, or rather, Kim and I sold some shares because we wanted some money on the side. And we did that at a market cap of $2 billion. So in 8 years, we'd gone from 20 million market cap to 2 billion market cap. Thank you very much. And today, I'm actually in the process of selling my remaining stake in the bank, because I want to do something else with my life. And we're still around $2 billion, right? So the interesting thing is that, of course, there are other things that play in. You started with 2 people. You're not going to be worth, well, actually you are today, right? But it's only if you do a cryptocurrency or something like that, right? Which we'll talk about tomorrow, by the way. But of course, there are other things. It's the flow of the business, and the financial crisis hit in 2008. That wasn't particularly helpful for many financial institutions, although we were pretty much okay. And actually, interestingly, I know that BB&T was very much okay compared to many other banks, because they also did a lot of rational things. But it is thought-provoking that really the entire value creation was actually done in those 8 years where we really were full on with this. So I thought about that when I was doing it, and at least that's what the numbers show. So there are probably other aspects to it, but that is the numbers, and numbers are always important for a banker. So let me wrap up, and maybe there's time for, I don't know, probably not. I normally speak my full allocation. No, there's maybe time for a few questions. So just to get back to 2000, I really sincerely remember still very clearly when Steen came in and threw that oily book on my desk and said, you absolutely have to read this book. I remember very clearly the revelation as you kind of walk through the first few hundred pages and next few hundred pages and the next few hundred pages, how you increasingly began to understand that the kind of rough ideas you had actually were not completely random. They were built on a strong foundation. I was 38 years old at the time. I had the business. I was married. I had 4 kids, a 5th on the way, and I actually had pretty strong views on society and politics. And then incidentally, they're not hugely different from the views that I hold today, but I always had an underlying worrying concern when I thought about it, and would never admit it, of course, but always this underlying worrying concern, what was the real foundation, that I believed in freedom, that I believed in capitalism, and was it really just my particular circumstances that drove that conviction? Was it because of the career path that I had taken? Was it because of my ambition that had led me to be a lifelong fan of individualism and freedom and capitalism? And could you, in completely different circumstances, have reached completely different? If I had gone on to become an archaeologist, would I have been a left-wing hippie or something like that, right? Nothing wrong with hippies, but just not left-wing, right? And this is a question, really, that I think most political and philosophical writings, at best, they don't answer it, and at worst, they actually they answer with a confirmation that, yes, it is random, and it is a result of your situation and your environment, which worldview you end up choosing. And Ayn Rand's answer to that question, in my view, is fundamentally different. Her answer is that as a rational being and as a man and not an unthinking animal, you have to choose the path of freedom and individualism. Not just because, and I think that's also something we really need to address here, but it's not just because it works better, because that's pretty much proven by now, isn't it? I mean, you can point to so many places where people have failed with socialism, and you can point to so many places where some degree of capitalism has triumphed. But you have to go beyond the purely utilitarian sort of it works best view, I think, and the real thing here is that it's because it's fundamentally in your own nature, and because it's the right thing, if you think it through logically. It is a necessity to support those things if you want to fulfill everything you can be as a human being. And it's a necessity for your survival. If you don't do it yourself, at least somebody else has got to be rational somewhere, because otherwise you'd get a very unhappy end very quickly, right? I think the use of your mind and the observance and respect for reality, but also the way that you can influence and form and change and develop that reality with your mental capacity, is the way that we prosper in this world, and it's not random, and it doesn't matter, and it's the same if you're an archaeologist and a banker. It cannot really lead, if you think it through, to any other logically coherent conclusion or result. So what I like very much about Ayn Rand, and I think we need to share with as many people as possible, is the fact that it removes this uncertainty and this insecurity about whether your choices are right and unavoidable, or whether they are just fickle and random, and they could have turned out in any other way, in any other situation. And getting this philosophical foundation for what most other commentators really only present as some kind of utilitarian argument that individualism and capitalism simply works better than collectivism and socialism, which is a good enough reason, but it's not the only reason. But very few people actually advance the moral argument, the philosophical argument, the logical argument by why it really has to be that way. And in my view, that is a real argument, even if by some perverse way, total lack of freedom and total submission to a ruler actually gave slightly worse results. I think I would still prefer the freedom and not submitting. Thankfully, it doesn't work that way. But this is the real argument for what the Institute stands for what Ayn Rand stands for what I think all of you here stand for, and we need to get that message out, because people clearly are not buying. They're clearly not buying this idea that it works better. I mean, I was just surfing a little bit a couple of days ago, and there was an article in Washington Times. I don't know why I ended up there, but about that there had been a poll where it showed that 56% of millennials, 56% answered that they would prefer either socialism or communism to capitalism. That's pretty shocking, I mean, there's a majority of millennials that actually think that they prefer socialism, communism to capitalism. So the slightly redeeming factor is that they had also asked people to identify with very simple terms what is capitalism, what is socialism, what is this and that, and it was only 33% of these millennials that could actually correctly identify what capitalism is. So maybe it was more of a random result, but still say very thought-provoking. At least it clearly shows that they don't get the same reaction as I got when I came home to my dad and I said something that could remotely sound like communism, right? So they don't, and actually that was another thing they asked them. 44% would take no offense if they were called a communist, interestingly. So that's something to work with. Although things are getting better and we're getting richer and wealthier, and I totally agree with that. Everything is any thinkable problem of a material nature will be solved in due course. There's still a lot of other problems in terms of people's thinking and people's reaction to those type of questions. So with that, I'll finish off and maybe take a couple of questions, and I'll say thank you very much for coming here and listening. Thank you. Thank you very much. Much appreciated, and thank you all for supporting the Institute and everything. So,
what I'd like to ask you is your forecast for the state of the Euro and the EU. But what I'm going to ask is, can you talk a bit about your hiring practices and what you felt worked well, and perhaps some advice for people looking for work?
So for people looking for work, or people looking to hire? Sorry, just to be clear.
I just wanted you to talk about your practices and your experience in hiring people, and maybe, what advice you would give to somebody.
Okay. Actually, interestingly, again, I'll just quote Jack Welch, because he told me, and if anybody has a really, really strong track record for hiring people and developing human talent, I guess it's Jack Welch, right? I mean, I think at one point, I don't know what it is today, but at one point, 40 CEOs in the Forbes 500 were somehow from the GE machine of leadership, so they're extremely in demand from other companies once they had been through Jack Welch's machine there. He also told me that in his view, the HR director was at least as important as the CFO, and that's a very uncommon view, I would say. I tend to agree, but it's a very, very uncommon view in most businesses, where the HR department is something that's a little bit pushed to the side and certainly not typically a part of senior management. So, but Jack Welch was probably, the benchmark, I would say, on top-level hires at least. And he said, Lars, when I was at my very, very peak, I got it right 3 out of 4 times. So, even Jack Welch said that he had to admit failure in at least 1 in 4 hires when he felt he was at his absolute peak of his career, right? So that injects a little bit of humbleness, humility into the discussion, and of course, hires are very important. It's very expensive to make a bad hire. It takes a lot of money to bring somebody on. If you use a headhunter and advertising, this and that, it takes a lot of time for them to, even if they're good, to not contribute an awful lot because they need to learn the ropes. And if you then have to let them go, that costs also a lot of money. So a mishire, even for a modest management position, can easily run into $1 million or $2 million. So it's important. What do we do? In the beginning, Kim and I would speak personally to every single person that somebody else wanted to hire. We had to kind of skip that when we got to like 1,000 plus. But if I have that opportunity, and it was realistically practical to do it, it was also very difficult when we spread over many offices around the globe, more or less. But if that's possible, whenever a team lead wanted to hire, even the humblest of positions, we would like to speak to the person, for just at least being part of the responsibility, and for making sure that the right story had been told about the business to the person in question. It's interesting, and I'm not sure I'm very good at hiring, so I'm not sure. I made many mistakes, including that fatal one in 2008, right? So I'm not so sure that I can give fantastic advice on it, but I would at least make very sure that they completely understand what they're getting into, and that there's some degree of correlation between their values and the business. I personally look a lot more at practical experience than nice university degrees. I've never been able to see a difference whether a person had an MBA or not, So I look a lot more at the practical experience. Actually, I kind of like, maybe it's because I'm not a university guy myself, but I actually like that they felt so eager to get out and do business that maybe they dropped university. And so I don't look an awful lot of that, but it depends, of course, on which type of job. Practical experience, if I can assess their persistence, I think persistence is probably the most important characteristic of nearly any, that people can go on also when the going gets tough, and when they have something that doesn't work out the way, that they can then continue. The value part, and actually, I was invited to do a TV show in Denmark on the least state-owned channel, which is going to be kind of, it's not a concept we bought like most of these are, but we built kind of a Apprentice meets Dragon's Den type thing with where I'm evaluating some companies, right? And there we're trying to do a psychological test actually to figure out is there ways, it's particularly about startup entrepreneurs than hire, see if there's specific characteristics beyond the most obvious ones that would work. The other thing I would say is if you can find a way, and that's very difficult to do in a politically correct way, but if you can figure out how intelligent people are, even by way of a test, there's not a lot that beats intelligence. If people are a little smarter, hereby I don't mean high education, but just not too stupid, but actually not too intelligent either. I saw it compared by a smart guy to basketball, right? If you're like 5'4", I'm trying to convert European number. You're like 5'4", you can be the greatest ball handler in the world, but you're probably not going to be great at basketball, right? On the other hand, if you're like 7 feet 6 or something, like you have some of these big African guys that come in very clumsy, and then they obviously can just stick it into the basket, but they never become great basketball players either. So 6'8", 6'10" is sort of the right level, and I'm not a big nerd, so I might be wrong, but I thought it was an interesting comparison, because I also have a couple of guys that are super smart, but they have really a problem getting specific. I can remember I have one in particular who must have an IQ of 180 plus or something. It's insane how difficult he is to understand. But I still keep him because he's kind of a little jewel to have in there, right? But he doesn't always deliver specific results. But I can remember once we had this big kickoff, big town hall that we like to start the years with, sort of in January, and I said to him, could you do a presentation, but please keep it at a layman's level. I said, yeah, sure, I'll do that, Lars. And there's like all of the colleagues sitting there in a big room like this, and he was completely unintelligible, and it was like, whoa. And then we had a piccolo, a guy that runs around serving coffee and stuff, and he'd just been hired, and he came up very shy and said, Mr. Christensen, I just want to say, I didn't understand a word he said, but I'm very proud to work for a company that has people like that. So I guess that's the closest I can get.
Hi. So Democrats in the USA love to put Scandinavian model on a pedestal, how great it is, etc. I've heard talks, especially is related to Sweden by Yaron and others. I'm curious, what do you have to say more as far as Denmark is concerned on that?
There's a lot of bullshit in those kind of stories, right? Because I don't know. I think our expectations are very low. It's because people are so used to paying huge taxes, and I mean it's pretty shocking. We have general tax pressure that's at least 20% higher than the U.S., right? On an average, we have cost of living which is easily 60% higher than the U.S. because of very high sales taxes and all sorts of weird environmental taxes, etc. So people just don't have an awful lot of money, and hence I guess the expectation is relatively low. So when they get asked, they say we're happy. If you dig a little bit into that, you'll find that we have a high suicide rate. We have a lot of people on different drugs just to keep going. So there's some people at least that are not quite as happy as they say. The system there, it is true that you have free schools and hospitals and this and that, right? But they're very, very poor quality. We have very, very long waiting lists. If you have even a minor thing that you need to get fixed in a hospital, 20% of people leave the school as analphabets. So what the public service delivers, which is apparently free, which of course is not because you're paying huge amounts of taxes, but it's just very low quality, right? So I think there's a lot of lies in this. What is true, actually, it's not a bad place to do business, Scandinavia. We actually have relatively flexible, but at least by European standards, relatively flexible hiring and firing rules. In Germany, you nearly marry somebody if you hire them, right? It's not like that in Denmark. And that's, of course, a payoff from this social system that there is unemployment support, etc., at reasonable levels So I would say running a business is not too bad. Corporate taxes is in line with European averages. As I said, you can rid yourself of people if you have to. You don't have an awful lot of red tape compared to, for example, Southern Europe. You have pretty high wealth taxes, so if you actually want to get some money out and spend it, it gets a little bit tricky. But as long as you keep it in the business and you build the business, that's not too bad. So I'd say it's not a terrible place to run a business. It's a little bit terrible place to be a upper middle class, reasonably highly paid person if you would have liked to save up some money and start your own business one day. But once you've paid your 150% car tax, once you've paid your gigantic house tax, once you've paid 25% sales tax on everything, once you've paid an infinity of green taxes on everything from nuts to bottles to, you name it, we got a tax for it. You can't actually save up, and I think that's a really, really big problem for Denmark, because I have some really smart people, and much as I would hate to see them go, I also like to see them go when they go out and they start their own businesses, right? It's very, very hard to save up. If I hadn't been in London, I don't think I could have started Saxo Bank over there. I made a decent salary. I didn't pay quite so much tax, so I could save up some money and start the bank. But I don't think I would have had Saxo Bank if I started in Denmark, and or I had remained in Denmark, and I think that's a real major problem for the economy, right? So it's a nice place. Come to Copenhagen one day, you'll have a nice time there, but I wouldn't recommend living there, and that's also why I live in Switzerland. So.
You said that you made this one-page paper that you gave to the bank 18 years ago, and you're still giving that out. Mm-hmm. Could you share it with this group?
Absolutely. Actually, it would be on our website somewhere, but I'll see if I can find a link. So I don't know exactly who I sent it, but I sent it to the institute, and whoever wants it can get it from there. But yeah, it's still around.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So you said you started a political party and you got a few officials in office, or a few politicians in office, right? So you're saying there are politicians with ethics?
I would say I would just qualify a little bit. I didn't start the party. Somebody else started the party. Then it went to hell. It came into, we have a completely different system in Denmark. We have a parliament. You have a hurdle rate of 2%. So if you can get more than 2%, you get a few seats. So we have 8-9 parties most of the time, and they have to find a way to figure out who can get a majority, right? Which actually has the interesting effect that a very small party can have very big importance, because if the red and the blue blocks are kind of 50-50 even, and they need the last 5 seats, a small party can have a very, very large impact, which is kind of the opposite of the UK, where unless you are really big, you're absolutely going nowhere, even though maybe you have 5 or 10% of the vote, like my good friend Nigel Farage had at times in the run-up to the Brexit, right? So I'm not a big fan of it, and I never ran for anything, and I never will run for something, but I just recognize that we're extremely dependent on these guys, and when I see people that, in my view, are right-minded, and they want to go down as right-minded as you can be as a politician, right? And I see they want to go that route, I think it's better to try to support them, right? So what happened with these guys is they had a completely confused project. There was a mixture of semi-libertarian, not very ideological guys generally, but they came in on sort of a wave of we want something new, then they collapsed. There's the only party ever, according to Guinness Book of Records, apparently, that ever elected in a parliament hit 0.0 in the polls. That's pretty impressive. You simply cannot find one person, not even your mom or your wife or anybody that wants to support you. So I called actually the leader at that time and said, Anders, that I knew quite well, and actually most of the socialists, they could see that the gravy train was moving away fast, so they left the party at that point. So my friend was left there with 0.0, but a good mind and a good, strong, liberalistic baseline. So I called him up and said, what do you think? Should we try to do something here? And then he said, yeah, that'd be nice. I'd like to take a talk. And then we gathered a few good people, literally just a handful of people. We put together a new program, which was more clear. We changed the name to make it clear what we stood for. And we found out that nobody in the media, I mean, we identified fake news before you guys did, but nobody in the media would write anything sensible about this party once you're at that point. You could only get in there if we suggested, putting a nuclear power plant on City Hall Square or something like that, But of course, the one advantage they had was that there was a couple of smart people involved around this, and I was willing to spend a little bit of money on it. So we ran one full-page ads to avoid the journalists, so we could just keep telling our story. And in 2 or 3 months, people said, okay, actually, that's a pretty nice story. I might consider voting for them. So we moved over this hurdle rate in 3 months from 0.0 to 2+. And after that, because of that dynamic, all of a sudden you're the most interesting party because you can actually pick the winner next time, and the rest is a long story. But has finalized in a center-right government, which is the best we're ever going to get in Denmark. At least we have a minister that's in control of education. We have one that's in control of the Interior Ministry. We have the Foreign Ministry and a few others. Do I like politics? Not an awful lot, but do I recognize that they're there and they'll be there for a long time? I think it's hard to not feel that if you're a banker, at least, right? I never ever told these guys, do this for me, do that. I mean, I think that would be highly inappropriate, but I think promoting people that at least wants to pull the country in the right direction, I think is better than doing nothing, because there's enough of people that will promote the bad guys, right? So I'm not sure if I answered your question.
No, I'm just asking for a story. I knew there was something there.
Yeah. I think it's an interesting story. At least it's something that we enjoy when Anders comes home from a foreign visit and we have a glass of wine and we think, hey, you were sitting here in a black burning hole, and now you're the foreign minister and vice prime minister of Denmark. So you can actually impact things with just a little bit of focus.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Do you have any stories from one of your 20 locations of a regulation or restriction causing you to engage in a less productive endeavor than you would have in a more capitalist country? Like, for example, in Atlas Shrugged, when they forced railroad speed to be only 60 miles per hour instead of 100, and it caused significant less productiveness.
Yeah, I have one or two of those. Yeah.
Could you share?
I say I have one or two of those. Yeah. Is it me for the rest of the conference, or? Yeah, there are many cases. In fact, as I think Yaron also described very eloquently, actually a lot of time is spent on just trying to accommodate regulation in some way that doesn't completely destroy business. And I have to say, as I said, I left operationally from the bank about 2.5 years ago because I realized I was spending literally 90% of my time on that kind of stuff, and it's just not for me. So it has a huge impact on the financial industry. And I would say, if somebody comes and proposes a great new product that would be highly beneficial for your clients, concern number 1 is regulation, concern number 2 is regulation, concern number 3 is regulation, and then maybe you can look at, would it be nice for the client? Could we make some money on it? It's a distant priority compared to analyzing regulatory impact. And I can understand there were some things in the run-up to the financial crisis that were pretty out of hand, but much of it caused by politicians. But it certainly swung extremely too far, the pendulum here, and it doesn't seem to be kind of coming back. So it's a big problem because, one, nobody dares to lift the phone and speak to a client anymore. He needs to sign a 140-page document before you even dare speak to the guy, right? Nobody brings out really innovative new products because the potential gain would be very small for a period of time, and then the cost of getting it wrong from a regulatory perspective could be huge. The best people leave the industry because who wants to spend their life just reading paperwork nonstop, So I think it's very, very damaging to the financial industry. I hope John one day has a wonderful speech on the U.S. I'm sure many wonderful speeches, but I heard one on the U.S. situation, which is also pretty challenging, I think. Yeah, So yeah, there are many examples, really many, and the main one is that innovation is getting cramped, customer service is getting destroyed because nobody dares to speak to the customers, and it's just not good. And I mean, at the end of the day, finance is very important for society, right? Very, very important. We may not be the nicest guys, but we're very important, right? So, and I think it was a very good opportunity. The politicians saw a very good opportunity to hit the industry very, very hard in the context of the financial crisis. I can remember Financial Times wrote an editorial where they said, it's like when a fight breaks out in a bar. I mean, you take the opportunity to hit all the guys you didn't like anyway, whether they did anything or not, right? And I think that's very true, and that's even from quite left wings of Financial Times, right? So, so it's a big problem. But I mean, maybe one day the pendulum will swing the other way because you need banks. I'm sorry to say, and you can't even fix it with cryptocurrency. So, thank you.
Wait, would you say that applies to all 20 locations or no?
To be honest, it's gotten to a point where you can't really open a location if it's not appropriately regulated because all the other guys will then get angry with you, right? So you actually pick places where you have reasonably sophisticated, organized regulators, because if you open somewhere where there wasn't regulation, then all hell would break loose, right? So in a way, you would go for heavily regulated locations because the other ones are even more dangerous, right?
Thank you.
Hi, we talked a little bit about the risk of a high tax rate and regulation, but also I think as a business you probably would admit that there's certain externality like government function have benefited your business, benefited individuals. I was wondering as a businessman, what would be a mechanism you would propose that's encouraging for the free economy, but also somewhat fair and create the right incentive for people to try to create and innovate?
Well, in a perfect world, there wouldn't be a lot a government did, right? I mean, you can say that you are in a situation where if you've taken away old people's money, as I described, you took it away from them for 30 or 40 years, and you've given them the expectations that they're going to get something in return, in my view, that's a contract you need to honor, right? So it will take a long, long time to work us out of this even if we began to do it, because there's so many implicit contracts in our society today that it's very difficult to do big revolutionary things without hurting people unreasonably, right? If you haven't had money to save up for pension because the government took everything from you, it's hard to also take away the pension that you paid for all your life, if you know what I mean. If you get to the position where you could have kept the money and invested them probably more soundly yourself, that would have been great. But so I think that, of course, there are many areas where we are, and that's also why to the former question about how you feel about politics, we are where we are, and we need to deal in the environment we are. Unless somebody here can get that goals organized pretty quickly, I'll be happy to join, right? But But I'll be stretched to think of things that they're really helping us with that you couldn't organize in a private function. I think if the payoff for having a relatively high payment for unemployment, if that payoff is that I don't have to keep people for years, like actually you do in Germany sometimes, I think that's a positive, but in a way, you could avoid both things by not creating the whole mess in the first place, right? But I would say that is at least an advantage that we have a relatively flexible labor market in Denmark, and that would probably be very hard to argue for in a country like that if you didn't have a welfare system that kind of took some of the insecurities out of that, in our type of society. But I'm really hard pressed to say things where I think they do a lot for the framework. I mean, I'm these days I invest in a lot of small startups, more sort of for fun and to learn something new many times. And there's a lot of funds in Denmark owned by the government that want to invest money in these startups. In fact, so many that you nearly have to apply, because otherwise you're at a clear disadvantage compared to other people trying to develop the same product. But I think it's very, very bad because it teaches people total disrespect for money, and then it makes them use it in an irrational way. And this public money is much more forgiven than than a private investor that will put certain conditions on it, which is for the benefit of the entrepreneur and for the business, right? So I'm not a great fan of the public sector getting involved at all in business, and I would just hope that we can reduce it over time. But I'm very aware that even if we made that decision, it'll take a long time to sort of get out of all the contracts that are implicit if you've been stuck in that system for a very long time.
Thank you.
Thank you. I think we are running to the last question.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah. All right. Thank you.
Thank you for your talk. I want to go back to your reading experience of Atlas Shrugged and ask you if you can specify, if you can, what element of the book really impacted you? In other words, was it the characters that struck you, grabbed you? Was it the plot? Was it the ideas that come out of all those long speeches? Another way of asking the question really is, what difference does it make that this is a novel, a work of fiction, as opposed to a treatise or an autobiography?
I think that's very, very, very important, and I think that's why Ayn Rand did it that way. That's something we discuss also at board level sometimes, because we're still selling 1 million books around the world, nearly 1 million books, and nearly 50-50 between the US and abroad. And I think that's hugely important, that there's maybe 800,000-900,000 people that go and buy one of Ayn Rand's books and get that inspiration. As to myself, it's very hard to say one thing sort of did it for me. There's a couple of characters I like very much, of course, like Reardon, but actually I had to read it a couple of times to really get the full picture of because when you read it from the beginning, there's a lot of sort of lines that are cast out that you only understand later what the implication really was of that. So I would say I read it every now and again, every second year or something, and I always find something new in the book, and I think just a reasonable understanding, you need to read it twice at least, right? So I liked some of the characters. I saw some things that I would like to aspire to be myself, and I wanted my business to aspire to be. So I guess the person is what's the characters is what catches you initially, and then you get more and more into the understanding of the underlying philosophy and the deeper points of the book, right? And then I saw even back then a lot of very clear parallels to what I was seeing in my own society. The sort of the slowly slipping away of rights, the slowly declining freedom. So I can only say all of the above, and I still try to hand out the book to a lot of people, because I think that's possibly the single most important thing we can do, each of us. So with that, I think the next. Thank you. Thank you.